folks. This is Tommy Waller with the Center for Security Policy. And this would normally be a weekly Secure the Grid Coalition teleconference. Every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have a nationwide coalition that gets together on the phone and focuses on protecting our nation's most critical infrastructure, its electric grid. And so today we decided to replace that teleconference with a webinar. And this webinar is going to explore a topic that's really important to our coalition. So the first thing I want to do is just briefly introduce myself and the Center for Security Policy, and then allow our experts that are part of the webinar today to introduce themselves. So our Center for Security Policy is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, policy oriented, and we sponsor that nationwide Secure the Grid Coalition. I think it's important for everybody to know that we don't take any funding from the government, we don't take any funding from any foreign sources, and we don't take funding from any company that could profit off of the policy recommendations that we make. So our organization in this webinar is purely directed towards the public interest. My own professional background, I recently retired from the Marines after 2 decades of service with experience in combat overseas. And probably the most important work that I ever did was actually for the US Air Force. And I'll explain that in just a little while as we get into the content of today's webinar. That webinar, of course, is that clean energy is a terrible thing to waste. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can have just years and years worth of clean energy produced for this country and really have energy security moving forward. So without any further delay, let me introduce our other panelists, our other experts, starting with Steve Curtis, who's going to give you just a short background on himself professionally and personally. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Tommy. My background is basically I have a master's degree in health physics, which is the study of how radiation affects people. I also have a veteran of the Army, so I did that for a while. But most of my professional career I spent in the Department of Energy in Nevada, affiliated with the Nevada test site. And I started out when we had the test program with the Russian verification in the early days. Well, early days of my career, later days of the test program. And from there, I went into emergency response. So I was a technical team leader for NEST teams and consequence management teams, looking for either trying to characterize accidents or trying to find lost or stolen sources, or even terrorism kind of devices. So I did that for about 15 years. After that, I was a consultant to the university system in Nevada, trying to develop some programs between the test site and them. And now I've moved out to Minnesota. I'm totally unaffiliated with any profit organization. I'm a completely grassroots advocate for the stuff we're talking about here today.
Awesome, Stephen. Thank you so much. And we're going to have Stephen go into great detail about that type of advocacy. And I think it's going to become very clear why it's important. Let me just introduce our next guest, Ed McGinnis, CEO of Curio. Ed, if you could just give the audience a quick background on your personal and professional life as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Pleasure to be here. I have worked for the U.S. Department of Energy for 30 years. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and moved up to Washington, D.C. to go to graduate school, and found myself having the great privilege of working for the federal government in the U.S. Department of Energy. During that period of time, the first half of my career, primarily I focused on nuclear security, counterproliferation, loose nukes, whether it was in Russia, helping secure warhead sites during the late 90s, or recovering radiological sources that could be used for a dirty bomb out of Iraq and other locations around the world. Under President Bush, I was asked to join the peaceful side of the nuclear energy sector or mission, and the other side of the coin, as we say. And I then I led the international nuclear work as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy for 11 years. I ran and stood up this Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, which ironically, the company I lead today is a recycling company primarily for nuclear waste, anything but waste. But back then, under President Bush, he had this vision of leapfrogging the U.S. back into the position of leadership globally, vice Russia and China, in nuclear, predicated primarily on nuclear recycling and small modular reactors. So I stood up that, I led that. when President Trump came on board, I was asked to step up and serve as Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy. I did that for 2.5 years under Rick Perry, in fact. And then after that, my last major tour before I punched out and joined this company was to serve at the White House as the Executive Director of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology.
Ed, thank you so much. I mean, it's pretty obvious between you both the number of decades of experience that you have in the nuclear industry world. We're going to kind of tell the story now about how both of these experts became associated with our Secure the Grid Coalition. So as I promised, the story about the Air Force, right? The work that I did as a Marine for the Air Force was part of the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, or EDTF. I was blessed to be asked to be a staff member for that, and really just because of my civilian job here at the Center for Security Policy and all the experts that I knew in the EMP world, the world of those that want to protect our grid and other infrastructure from electromagnetic pulse and other forms of hazards that could take it down. And it was during this time where I was working for the Air Force, and we're looking at what are the things that we really need to try to protect when it comes to this threat of EMP, and the idea that we could, as a nation, potentially suffer a really prolonged or widespread power outage from such an attack. And what we really concluded was that our nuclear facilities, and particularly what we called at the time spent nuclear fuel, was a big concern. And the reason is, and Steve will go over this momentarily, the reason is that our nuclear power industry, which let me just say, it's the safest industry in our country, probably in the world, as an industry, right? But when they use nuclear fuel to produce electricity in a reactor, it's only used for about 3 years, and it's cycled out every 18 months. And after that period of time, these large, they're rods, essentially 20-foot long rods full of radioactive material, they have to be cooled. And it's usually about 5 years they have to be cooled in a large 40-foot deep tank of water. And of course, that requires circulation to keep it cool. And so our concern at the Air Force EDTF was what happens if the grid goes down for a long time. And the operators of those spent nuclear fuel pools have a problem keeping the power flowing and keeping the water flowing. So that's how I personally became very concerned about the issue. And because it was part of the lexicon with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, and the Air Force to call it spent nuclear fuel, that's what I've called it for a long time. But you're going to hear, even in this webinar, a transition, right? And you saw in the title that it talked about waste. Sometimes we hear, and just a couple of weeks ago, I heard this. What about nuclear waste? I was in the Midland, Odessa area, and was asked a question. We've got people who are trying to bring, high-level nuclear waste to the Permian Basin to just store it here temporarily. Is that a good idea? My answer was no. Instead, we should be recycling it. And so that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So through this process over the last few years of me personally and our Secure the Grid Coalition becoming very concerned about the prospect of a long-term blackout and what to do with this, what we used to call spent nuclear fuel, but what we should call slightly used nuclear fuel, we met this man, Stephen Curtis, who is going to, in just a moment, tell us all about the promise, the opportunity associated with slightly used nuclear fuel. So what I looked at as a risk and as a hazard and as a problem could actually be an amazing solution for our energy security needs here in the United States. So that's the quick backstory to kind of explain how we came to meet Steve Curtis. And I'm going to let Steve kind of tell the rest of the story about what he's been doing and how it intersected with us before we then go to Ed. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tommy. I will tell you up front that I did live in Las Vegas for about 38 years. And I went to my first Yucca Mountain Waste meeting in 1981. And at that time, I decided, well, we should certainly in Nevada take this material. And I learned later that we probably would never bury this material. There's just too much value in the energy still contained in the material to go on. So I'll give you a few fun facts. When you fission one atom of uranium, you create more energy. We create about 50 million times more energy than you do when you burn one molecule of coal. So you can see the advantage of having a very, very compact source of energy. And the other part of it is that if you calculate, if you fissioned every bit of uranium we have left over from spent fuel, in fact, about 96% of the material inside the nuclear power reactor fuel rod does not change, doesn't change anything. When it comes out, it's the same as when it went in. And it is possible to fission all of that material, remember, 50 million to 1, to produce energy. And that's what I think, that's my advocacy of what I think we should do. And if you do the calculation on that, just the 90,000 tons that is sitting on our sites today, that comes up to about $10 trillion of energy at 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Now, I say 1 cent per kilowatt hour because I believe eventually that given the right competitive nature of the power distribution system, we could probably get down to a value, something on that range. That sounds fantastic to everybody, but it is truly possible. But now we're getting 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and I don't think anybody that I know even gets power at 10 cents a kilowatt hour anymore. But that would be $100 trillion worth of energy sitting on those pads. Now, we throw energy dollar numbers around in trillions and billions and millions all the time, but $100 trillion is $300,000 per person in the United States. So we're talking a significant amount of value that exists sitting on our pads, and we have the technology today. And I'm really thankful we have a company here today that's actually in business to do that. There are more than one. There's several out there, several tens of them out there that are looking at different types of small modular reactor or generation 4 nuclear reactor process. This one is really looking at the fast reactor technology, and it's nice to have a company that's actually putting their shoulder to the boulder and moving it down the road. And it gives you the confidence that this is really possible. It's not just a pipe dream that if we spend enough money, we can do it. In fact, I advocate using private enterprise to do this because for 40 years, it hasn't been successful. So here's a bit of my philosophy and the way I'm looking at it. We haven't been successful in the government for 40 years in moving this nuclear solution anywhere further down the road. And I will tell you, as a physicist and as a guy who understands this business, it is the easiest part of the nuclear fuel cycle. We've solved all the rest of the parts. We had a solution for this, and now it's been tied up in the government for 40 years. So I think the only way we need to go forward is a private approach to this. So my idea is if I could approach a governor and explain this story, explain the possible business applications of moving this down the road and give them enough incentives, because the attitude now is we don't have a single governor who will consent to accept use nuclear fuel. Not one of the 50 states, none of them. So before we can move anything forward on this, we need to get over that hurdle.
Right, right.
So my process is to get to a governor, explain the concept, and the term is consent to accept. And the way the government looks at it now is if you're a governor and you decide you want to take this, you can define what consent means, and you can define what benefits you want to take out of it. And so I think if we prepared a governor with the right approach and the right attitude, he could understand this, he or she could understand this. And the first one to take advantage of this is going to be the one that wins the golden prize. And my idea would be to consolidate this with a industrial park, where we call it Clean Energy Industrial Park, where we hope a bunch of these companies would come to a central area to develop their technology. And I'm unique in this, and people will shout me down for this, but I think we need a tech transfer national laboratory for the national labs. We have 19 national labs that are working on basic research, and very rarely does this technology make it out. So if we had a focus on how to transition this technology the labs are working out to private enterprise, it would be huge. So if you mated those two together, industrial park with companies and a national lab optimized for tech transfer, we could really move this down the road. And a governor would really love to have those, I think, in their states. And then if you're making a deal, of course, you can make a deal for whatever you want to if you're the governor, but you can ask for microgrid research, you can ask for military, applied engineering research, even grid work. I was at the Nevada test site and they have an isolated grid out there that they never bothered to use for any of this research. So you wonder what goes on in the higher halls of government, but if you make this into a private business could solve this pretty lickety split, I think.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, that's and that's a perfect transition to a private business here in a minute. But let me just recap for a second what Stephen's just sharing with us, right? So we're talking about roughly 93,000 metric tons of slightly used nuclear fuel that's already been mined. It's already all of the work to get it here has been done, and it's spread out between around 75 sites being stored. And Stephen, remind me, how much money are we as taxpayers paying to keep it stored that way? Just right off the top of your head?
Right now, the government's paying about just under $1 billion a year, and every time they load another dry cask on the storage, they get more money in the utilities. So we're paying about $1 billion a year just for the reactor companies to store it.
So $1 billion a year we're paying as tax dollars to maintain the status quo, right? Absolutely ridiculous. And so what Stephen's talking about is a concept to take the stuff that's already been mined and be able to produce electricity with it that would power our country for between 150 to 250 years just with the fuel from those light water reactors, right? And you can go in and we can talk, we have before talked about using depleted uranium stocks, and you could potentially get 1,000 years worth of electricity for the United States of America with things that have already been mined and pulled out of the ground. And this is exactly what we have told the current U.S. Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, twice. She's talked about the need to have, these energy earthshot initiatives. And we've argued that this is exactly one of the things that should be an earthshot initiative, is to recycle our slightly used nuclear fuel. So as I promised, I want to transition to exactly what Stephen said, which is that this is something that can be tackled and should be tackled in the private sector. So along the story of us becoming aware of this, having Stephen educate us, begin to advocate for this as a policy from, again, everyone from governors to our Secretary of Energy, we were blessed to be able to meet a company that can actually do it. Because it's one thing to talk about something in theory or to say, hey, this is a good idea, this is a policy we ought to do. It's another thing when you have somebody come in that's actually figured out how to do it, has the patents to be able to protect their intellectual property, and is raring and ready to go. And so, Ed, I'd like to turn it over to you. And if you would just recalibrate us for a second on just the time. If we didn't do this, right? If we kept the status quo and we paid $1 billion a year for the utilities to keep storing it where it's at, how long would that stuff last versus what you guys can do with it? And Steve, or Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Tommy, and thanks, Stephen. Bottom line is, if you do not recycle this material, the NRC requires, and this is hard to believe, but Dilbert reigns supreme here still, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, requires a 1,000,000-year secure, safe standard for storage. If you do not recycle this material, you are going to have this material untapped. It's the largest stockpile of clean energy in the world because we have the largest fleet of nuclear reactors in the world. Makes sense because of government policies going all the way back to Carter. It was decided not to recycle this material, even though, as it was mentioned, when you run fuel through a reactor, when it's running there about 3 to 5 years, when you pull it out, you've only used at most 4% of the energy value. Like you said, you have enough energy, clean, non-carbon emitting fuel in that stockpile to meet all of the US's electricity needs for at least 150 years. And oh, by the way, an enormous amount of isotopes that are in their resident, that many of which to this very day we're dependent on Putin and Russia for. Almost 100% of the uranium comes from foreign suppliers. To this day, 2% or so is American. And if you recycle the material, you can provide with our facility as much as 40% of the uranium requirement a year. It's sitting below our feet virtually. So this material, what this material represents is an enormous national and economic sectoral resource and opportunity. Our company is essentially a mining company. You see the technology that is just to my right. This is one of our state-of-the-art tri-vessel, about 3 foot high, in ground. We'll have about 10 of these in a state-of-the-art NFL-size facility. We're partnered with 4 national labs, the leading national nuclear labs in the world, frankly, with the US Department of Energy. They're funding us 80% right now, non-dilutable investment to do the proof of concept at world-class national labs, done in 3 years. And then we have the plan to then scale up to get a scaled up version 1 year after, one more scale up, and then full commercial by about 2033. So we have our patent. We got it sooner than we thought, and we got all our 24 claims. We asked for 24 claims, and we got all 24. We have industry partners ready to go, eager to be a customer or deploy. We have the largest radioisotope manufacturer in the world, the German company called Eckert and Ziegler. They're out of Germany, large presence in the US. We already have intent for major offtake agreements. We've already identified about 12 different isotopes representing billions of dollars for market opportunity a year. I was in the government 30 years. I rose up the ranks, always trying to be humble because, frankly, being paid by the taxpayer who had the right to be angry because we weren't doing the job we needed to do. But I had a lot of tire tracks on my back attempting to run and lead the programs for solving our nuclear waste problem. And my conclusion was the government was not capable of doing it. So at the end of my tour at the White House, I just serendipitously met these amazing entrepreneurs out in New York City, and they had the vision. They saw this as a major natural resource. They had the flexibility and opportunity to do it from scratch and bring in the best of the best. And we are in a position now to unlock this market. I call it the SpaceXify the market, the Teslafy the market. So I left a high position where I had no mandatory retirement, but I want to make a positive difference for this, our country. And I knew, I've seen it firsthand, one of the greatest lost opportunities, untapped resources, are those 90,000 metric tons plus sitting around 75 locations around the country that is absolutely technically doable for extracting. Absolutely. It's economically doable. It's been just simply a product of government policies over the years. The good news is we're in a unique moment where we have a stronger bipartisan support for nuclear to meet existential threats, whether it's energy security, geostrategic, whether it's climate, jobs, you name it. And so just to give you an example of how tangible this bipartisan development is happening and support, I've had the pleasure to meet directly, personally in the office of Senator Cruz 2 times in the past several months or 6 months. And he has actually developed and is sponsoring legislation to support nuclear recycling because he gets it. And in fact, he has sponsorship from across the aisle, including from New Mexico, from Senator Heinrich. And that legislation is very important. And we're seeing on the House side appropriations for new money coming in for recycling. Recycling is a no-brainer. It's time that we do it. We're sitting on top of the world's largest cache of clean nuclear fuel, of radioisotopes some of which were dependent on Russia, and it helps fight cancer, explore space, industrial, for well logging, for oil exploration, you name it. And so now we're working primarily with states in the Appalachia region of the United States, because why Appalachia? For a number of reasons as far as where we may site our facility. Our facility is going to be a good 56-year facility. It's going to be a facility that has about 3,000 full-time jobs, most of which are not advanced degrees. They're trade-based, high school, 2-year associate's degrees with very good training in some of the highest medium, and generational income you're going to get in this country. But one reason why we're looking at the Appalachia region is because we want to be as close equidistant to the preponderance of the 75 sites that have this slightly used nuclear fuel. And the majority of the reactors on the eastern side of the Mississippi. And so whether it's Virginia, West Virginia, or Kentucky, that region is optimal from a logistics perspective. Another reason, though, is because the geography of some of these former coal mine sites where they have had flat top removal, we're looking for a good 300 or 400 acres with good natural security around. It's going to be a highly secure facility, but we're going to need access to rail, power, and trade-based workforce. Appalachia has all of those. And we're speaking directly with governor's offices, with county executives, with mayors. And what they tell us is they absolutely want this. And they know, and they've lived it, and that they have been the backbone of the United States industrial revolution in the coal industry. Now they're on hard times, incredibly hard times. It's tragic to see the amount of poverty and how devastating the anti-fossil policies have been on this area. Yet they want to be a part of the future, so they recognize any state that houses this facility is going to become the largest clean nuclear fuel supplier likely in the world. So they're excited about it. We have a unique moment here, Tommy, and I'm excited to be with you and to speak to and communicate with your audience.
Well, we're super excited to have you. Ed, a couple things that you mentioned. So you talked about the bipartisan effort there in New Mexico and Texas, and that recalled my visit to the Permian Basin, where I was asked, like, hey, people want to bring, again, they called it high level nuclear waste, which of course is one term, but we're now calling it slightly used nuclear fuel. But it was this idea that they would just put interim storage, like temporary storage of all of this near one of the most valuable repositories of fossil fuels, at least for petroleum development in our country, right? So my personal thought was, hey, that's a terrible idea. And so it's very exciting to know that there is a bipartisan effort to do something else, like what you just described, Ed, which is no, don't do that, just recycle it. And in terms of the scenario you just brought up, whether it's West Virginia or somewhere else, that image that is to your right as we're looking at you in the screen, I think you said it's like a 3-story high, reactor. The scenario you brought up where you had all of it fully operational. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the last time we talked, I started to do the math and how much you could recycle per year once fully operational, to draw down that 93,000 metric tons. How many years? So we talked before about the NRC requiring 1 million years of storage, and that this stuff would need to be.
Mind-boggling.
So how fast, once you're up and running, how fast can you draw that down and have it not be a risk anymore for this country?
We can recycle all of our nation's nuclear, used nuclear fuel, treated as nuclear waste within about 30 years or less, once full operational. And that is recycling all of the commercial, slightly used nuclear fuel that has been treated as waste and is essentially stranded in 75 locations in 35 states around the country. And so we will be able to do that. And when we recycle all that material, Tommy, it is an amazing triple bank shot, as Secretary Rick Perry used to tell me, and that when we recycle this material, we will only have about 4% or less of the original high-level radioactive material. With that material in such a smaller amount of material, suddenly we have many different options. We don't need Yucca Mountain. We could dispose of them in boreholes. We have borehole companies we're talking to now. The U.S., as we know, the oil industry, we have a storied past. We are experts at drilling. And so we can drill thousands of feet down and deposit in these containers the 4% or less. And on top of it, the cherry on top of the cake here is that the material will only, relatively speaking to millionaires, only be unsafe for humans to be around for about 300 years. But again, when you put it down thousands of feet, it's not coming back up. But even if it were, you've got about 300 years to deal with instead of 1 million. And you have 4%. instead of 100%. And then you have it being done by the private sector instead of off of the backs of the taxpayer and telling him it's going to be over $1 trillion eventually. And then you're also solving so many other things. You're reducing security, environmental issues. Our process, one of the big advantages we have is that all the other reprocessing recycling facilities around the world, Russia, France, the UK, Japan, the UK recently stopped, but the way they do it, they use an old process straight out of the that originated from the 40s and the Manhattan Project, and that's the Purex process, where they use acid liquid based process, an aqueous based process, and it actually generates more waste as they're trying to recover the waste. Ironically, ours is a dry process. We don't use an acid aqueous process, and we have an ultra secure process. And the way it's being done in other parts of the world, they pull out pure streams of plutonium that represents enormous security threat. You'll never be able to do it in the U.S. So, and the reason why we've been able to do it is because these others are state-owned recycling reprocessing plants, gargantuan sizes of small cities. They're $20, $30 billion sunk investment. And not only do they not have an entrepreneurial approach to things, but they can never pivot away to then come up with a clean slate design like we did. So we designed the best of the best, and we believe it's more like what we saw with reusable rockets and Tesla. I don't believe in SpaceX. I don't believe SpaceX developed many new alloys and technologies. They took as many things at the high TRL level, off-the-shelf technology, but it's the innovative bringing together in combination and use of technologies that allowed them to transform a state-run dominated sector like the space-based sector and totally disrupt it. That's what we're setting out to do.
Wow. Well, and it's exciting because, like you said, you have other companies and industries that have already proven that they can. We were getting some really good questions in our little Q&A chat, and I'm sorry, folks, I should have told you at the beginning. If you have questions, that at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A deal. Just type your questions in there. I'm going to do the best I can to answer as many of them. And I'm going to ask our other participants to kind of look into that window. But I want to start with Steve Curtis for a second. I had two questions, and I think Steve can probably answer both of them in a way. So one is, if we were to recycle this slightly used nuclear fuel, would we then no longer have to store these 20-foot rods? Will this take the energy completely out of the used fuel and make it safe, no longer needing intense storage for safety purposes? And the second question, kind of similar. The person said, I'm completely on board with recycling the materials, but concerned about security, about transporting the material across the United States, and what kind of security issue that would be. So I'd like to, Stephen has a huge background in nuclear safety and security. Could you just kind of explain for the audience the answer to those two questions about the fuel rods themselves and what would be left, and exactly how the process would go from the current storage facility to where it might be recycled, Stephen?
Okay, ideally, when you do this process, and there's many different ideas. There's at least 4 or 5 companies with molten salt fast reactor technology that are looking at their different approaches to it. Ideally, like I said, you'd want to fission it all. You'd want it all to be transitioned in fission. And so if you did that, you end up with something called fission products, okay? And fission products are the things that make the nuclear fuel very hot physically and hot radiologically, and why we have to protect them today. The main reason that we have to protect them. So they're deadly radiation if you don't shield them, but we can easily shield them and we can easily cool them, and we're doing that in a very good fashion today. And there has never been an issue with either naval nuclear reactors or commercial reactor wastes causing an accident or an incident with any of this stuff. So we're very good at that. The idea with that, when you make the chemical transition, and by the way, Tommy, you can do this anywhere in the United States. You don't have to have a special a geological formation, or you don't have to be next to a whole bunch of water or anything like that. You can do this. Any governor could make this declaration and do it in their state. And we looked at another part of this is most fission products are rare earth metals and rare earth elements that we're really, really trying to get. So after about 40 or 50, 50 or 60 years or somewhere in that range, they can be mined. And if we fissioned all of this material, there might be enough of them there to make an interesting project to mine those out and use them. But you'd have to wait because they're radiologically hot. And so that would be a while down the road. As far as transportation, the nuclear Navy transports their reactors all the time. There's millions of miles on the road of transportation accidents that have never caused any harm to anybody. So it's really a technically pretty easy engineering process to make that happen. People are worried about it, so they put a lot of interest into it, but they can be transported if you need to fairly easily. Our idea eventually is that we'd like to be able to get technology to do it on site. There are different, like I said, different engineering approaches, and maybe eventually they could fix something up on site to do each one on site. I'm not the engineer behind all the techniques, but ideally you would not transport it, but do the transition on site. So these are all ideas that can come up if we put our free enterprise thinking caps on in the private industry that can do this. And of course, any idea that is the best and most economical and the most marketable will win the day. And a lot of these reactors are made for different applications, remote applications, large city applications, and everything. And actually waste burners, like we're talking about, the slightly used nuclear fuel turned into energy. Right. So I don't see any technological challenge that even hasn't been overcome already. There are engineering challenges that we have to work out, like everything else we invent, but there's no technological leap of giant knowledge that needs to be done.
Well, I just let me just second that, Stephen. Thank you for answering the question. I think we answered a few more because I saw one that was asking about the important rare earth elements found in the slightly used fuel. So you sort of answered that, and I'm going to ask Ed in just a moment to double down on some of those elements and the areas where they could be used and what kind of commercial value. But let me also just reinforce your point about transportation. You know, DOE has something called the Office of Secure Transportation for different types of nuclear materials. And you know, I served in a force recon company in the Marine Reserves. A lot of our reserve Marines, that was their civilian job. And I will tell you that those guys were trained. I mean, they were the ones teaching all the courses at our reserve unit on everything from firearms to tactics, right? And their day job was guarding nuclear material. So we've been doing this for a long time in this country. I have the utmost confidence that, you know, a partnership between those types of organizations and potentially even the private sector. There's lots of private security companies out there that could be trained and contracted. You know, if you had a private organization that took the lead on this. This happens all the time. We do it all the time in lots of places all around the world. So I just wanted to double down on Steve's answer. But let me go back to Ed for a moment, because Ed, I remember, I mean, you kind of touched on it in your previous comments, but if you want, you know, maybe just list off just some of those different rare earth and different types of isotopes and some of the value that comes out of it. Because Steve and I, until we met you, you know, we were really in this for the electricity part, you know, powering this country for hundreds of years on the electricity that could be generated from the slightly used nuclear fuel. You can not only do that, but now you're bringing in just this gigantic economic opportunity with all the components. So could you talk a little bit about that, Ed?
Yeah. First of all, when I mentioned that we've identified through market signals and offtake indication agreements from different industry leaders, we've identified already about 12 different isotopes that have substantial market opportunity. We've done pro forma analysis for years out on it. For example, strontium-90. Strontium-90 is key for many defense and also tech development, coming up with micro batteries, like, for example, diamond encased nuclear batteries and others that are being developed. And strontium-90 is that primarily go-to isotope. Strontium-90 is in very short supply. We would be pulling out resident in the slightly used nuclear fuel larger amounts of strontium-90 than anywhere else in the world. Krypton-85. Krypton-85 right now is there is a very, very limited constrained supply chain, primarily because of Russia. Krypton 85 is important for a lot of things, not only medical, but it's important for our defense, our Navy. It's very good at detecting leaks and pressure vessels, et cetera. We have extremely short supply of that. We would have large volumes in there. Tritium is needed to start up fusion reactors, not the least of which defense. We will be able to, and we plan to pull off tritium. So many different isotopes. In fact, there's a potential for the isotope market in this recycling business of ours to eclipse the repurposed fuel that we'd be selling for current reactors, and also the advanced fuel for non-light water reactors we call transuranic or true fuel. I see a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I want to related to what I had perhaps triggered.
Yeah, go
with
ahead, Ed, if
regards
you see
to,
one or two.
right,
On
Texas and New Mexico, and then I see someone saying Arkansas. Oh yes, we have already spoken to in depth with delegates from the legislatures from Arkansas. They were very interested. Some of the members are very interested in our new cycle technology. One of the delegates actually came to our headquarters and spent some time to hear. I want to be clear that Appalachia is not the only location. We may have an East Coast, West Coast facility. We may have more than that. So absolutely Arkansas and others. I also saw a question or two on Oklo and Elysium and others who have said that they're going to recycle, or may have suggested the reactor is not going to require recycling. Elysium is now called Exodus, and they certainly still are suggesting they're going to do smaller scale recycling. So will Oklo, primarily because Russia is the only supplier of the type of fuel called HALEU. It's a higher enriched LEU fuel that's going to be needed, or that's going to be optimized or preferred for Oklo's microreactor, and possibly for others. And so they're different from our space. Frankly, I believe we're the only company in the US in our space. Our technology is set up to be to be able to process at the scale of our entire nation's slightly used nuclear fuel, 90,000 metric tons. These other companies primarily they would recycle in order to have fuel for their own microreactors. Ours is going to be recycling all of our nation's so-called nuclear waste for fuel to go into virtually every reactor, both current and future.
Right, right. Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. And it actually leads right into another question that I think and I'll have Stephen because recall us talking about this, and then Ed, you can jump in as needed too, which is the question of, okay, so we've got that 90,000 metric tons of our own. Would we be able to take on this slightly used fuel from other countries? Because in the question the person asked, creating essentially a strategic reserve, right, of nuclear fuel spent or used nuclear fuel. So, Stephen, in your estimation, as a kind of a policy idea for a governor, where would you stand with respect to taking other countries' slightly used nuclear fuel? And then Ed, after Stephen goes, I'd like to hear how Curio could help with that too.
We could absolutely do that. And in fact, if you're looking at the long-term betterment for the world, a sort of a quality of life perspective of it, electricity is absolutely necessary, and affordable, attainable, and robust electricity is critical to quality of life throughout the world now. So you got countries overseas that have to walk, some people have to walk a mile to get water. They have no electricity support at all. There's a whole country over there that runs off of one hydroelectric dam. So the ability for doing this is astronomically large throughout the world, but you have to start somewhere. And I think that what we would like to do is, I would like to see is some of this technology being either franchised or just given away. If eventually there's enough money in this for everybody, you're talking tens of trillions of dollars. A lot of people can get profit off of this and still be beneficial to everybody. So if you're looking at the long-term aspect of quality of life, like I said, this could be done anywhere. There's spent nuclear fuel all over the world in different forms, and you could really lift the overall quality of life of everybody with this idea that would lead to really, really inexpensive electricity and very, very robust sources of electricity, like we're talking about with the grid. We got grid transmission and production both have to be in concert to deliver people electricity. So we need to secure up both sides of that. But yes, I think that there is a large market for this, and like Ed said, that the first place it goes is going to be the gold mine for it. They're going to be the start of it. They're going to be the center of innovation for this whole process. And yes, there's other states. We've been to other states and talked to them. We talked to New Hampshire. I was there for 2 separate weeks in June of 2018, and they decided to do a study. Arkansas has decided to do a study. So what you really need to do is you need to grab this opportunity to run. The first state that does grab this opportunity, I think, will be the winner. But politics as it is, everybody's not really focused on the right thing, and you were referring to getting people understanding this. And so how we put that out there to the people, not only the people, but to we need to go to fossil fuel conferences. Environmentalists love nuclear. They just materially don't understand it, and nobody goes to their conferences and talks about it. So if we start talking to these people who are really waiting to hear the answer for fossil fuel is we're probably going to have fossil fuel for 6 or 7 decades anyway. I mean, I don't see any way out of that. And if you're looking about a 2 generation of change, that's not going to hurt anybody's livelihood or wealth or market stature. And fossil fuel companies would be well versed to engage in this as a follow-on energy source in the long term, instead of trying to fight it as a competitor. And so those things, we need to get out to those areas and start talking about this.
Well, I want to, before we close out, we are going to talk a little bit about how people can get involved in that process. Let me just ask Ed, when we just had the question about importing, from other countries, slightly used nuclear fuel. Ed, any additional comments on that before we get into the discussion about what we need to do to promote this idea, both as a policy initiative and as an investment opportunity? Anything on the foreign aspect?
I've lived and breathed this issue under President Bush, as part of standing up this global nuclear energy partnership. That was precisely one of the goals, and that is to capture the global market, which is enormous. It's a good, it's about 75% of the market, except for the US. So the US is the largest market, but there's about 440 nuclear reactors out there. There are probably 2/3 or 3 times as much nuclear, so-called used nuclear fuel around the world waiting to be recycled. And so the idea was that we could marry it up, we can combine nuclear recycling in the US. This is very sensitive technology. So in many respects, we would not want to or even get approval to be able to build a recycling facility like Curios in another non-nuclear weapons country, rightfully so. But the idea would be able to offer take back and recycle and combine it with reactor sales. And then you really have an opportunity for capturing market at a scale that we've never seen in the past, and also leapfrog the US. We have major security implications without a take back regime. Just look at the UAE. The UAE has 4 large Korean built nuclear power plants now. And where's that fuel going to go? Right now, there's no arrangement for that fuel to go out, and it could sit there for decades until it's cooling more and more, and it could present a target or an attractive, target for not so good ideas. So the idea of offering recycling internationally is very important. I have tire tracks on my back, however, by doing it the wrong way in the federal government, where they got in front of the communities. They started talking to foreign countries about take back before they had full consent and agreement and understanding by the communities where the facility would be. So our priority right now is the US market. That's our priority. But ultimately, the global market is enormous, and it is absolutely out there and would be optimized with the type of recycling facility we have that is ultra secure, in a dry process, environmentally sustainable, in a way that none of the other large behemoth state-owned recycling plants are like.
So really, I mean, what you're talking about, Ed, is that you guys could take care of our stock of slightly used nuclear fuel in the United States in roughly 30 years. And then when you're done with that, you've got basically another 90 years worth of business opportunity. So this in terms of an investment opportunity, to me, it seems just incredible.
We wouldn't even have to necessarily wait for that period
Right.
of time.
Just start.
It's just important for the community to understand and accept the value proposition. And I believe once they pivot from what they have been conditioned to think of, that this is nuclear waste and it's not, and that suddenly it's going to be around for a million years just because the government policies barred it in the past from being recycled. Suddenly, if you recycle it, you only have about a tiny fraction of the original and many options for doing it. And it has absolutely generational major economic implications to the states. That's why actually Governor Youngkin has an energy plan 2022 that explicitly calls for a moonshot of an SMR with nuclear recycling. That's why I have personally spoken to him about it. He gets it.
Right.
He told me that one day. He said, "Oh, you're in the recycling business? Can you believe this nuclear waste that's sitting around the country? We've only used 4%." I couldn't believe he knew that. Bam.
Right.
He
You're
already
like,
knew it.
this has been my
It was
life for 30
impressive.
years. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, and that answers one of the questions we had too about SMR. So SMR is a small modular reactor, right? And the question was, can you use this recycled, nuclear fuel in an SMR? Of course, the answer is
Absolutely. We can, this fuel
right.
from our reactor can fuel our light water reactors large, the small modular light water reactors, and the advanced non-light water. We have transuranic fuels, and we have our own reactor designs. We're developing a molten salt reactor, a reactor we call HOPE, and among others that's optimized with the fuel. But that's where I was saying our company is different. Our company is set up to be a supplier of fuel to all reactors and to recycle virtually all reactors use nuclear fuel.
Well, I'll tell you, we're down to about 7 minutes left. I want to keep this at an hour. I do want to quick shout out to Keith Ammon, who's on. He's actually the chair of that New Hampshire Study Commission. So Keith, thank you for taking the lead to establish the commission. Thanks for joining us on this. We're interested, obviously, in getting the answers that are needed at every state that wants to explore it, getting you guys the answers as fast as we can, and so that we can waste no more time on this thing they call waste and start recycling it. So in terms of the way forward, I want to give Steve just a minute or two to discuss, the grassroots effort, and then I'm going to close this out with some instructions on how we're, for the way forward, the couple hundred people that are live right now in this webinar and the potentially thousands that can watch it afterwards, what exactly we plan to do to achieve the sort of advocacy that Steve has dedicated his life to. So Steve, if you would give us some kind of final parting shots, guidance and suggestions, and then I'll close this out with those specifics.
Great, thanks you, Tom. From my perspective, we spend an awful lot of time talking to the federal government, and they've really produced no reasonable answer in 40 years. So we want to take it down a notch. We feel a governor could make a strong case if he would incorporate this concept, and could probably turn the head of the federal guys. And why not? Because a private solution, like Ed said, is $1 trillion less expensive than a public solution, and a lot less time. So why not move in that direction? To do that, number one, you need the public to understand. And I can't go talk to all the public, but you guys can. So every opportunity we have to go talk to a civics group or a Kiwanis group or something, go take advantage of it. Go talk to them about it. We also need, like I said, to get the fossil fuel industry to stop supporting anti-nuclear efforts, because they listen to those anti-nuclear efforts, and a lot of them are not accurate. And then the environmentalists really, really like it. There's been sort of a large transition away from wind and solar towards nuclear, but they don't really understand nuclear. So we need more people to go to environmental conferences and have a talk with them. And politicians need to understand it's hard to get politicians to sit down long enough to listen to this. And I will tell you, my partner is in Virginia and actually did float that idea to the Virginia guys, and they materially ignored us, but apparently some of it they retained. And so, but we do need a governor that's going to stand up and say, I will consent to accept use nuclear fuel, because that's the bottleneck. So that to me is the goal, and I'll talk to any governor, any group anywhere that wants to hear about it.
Awesome. Stephen, thank you. Ed, any parting shots before I give some final guidance on the way forward?
First of all, I agree with Stephen that federal government has shown that it is not capable of doing it, and I see that as a serendipity in a way, because the industry should be doing this and should have done it from the beginning. Finally, for whatever reason, the stars in alignment, the lane is opening up. So what we're going to do, what we're doing right now, is like Nike. We're just doing it. We're going for it. We're not waiting, and we're hoping that the public will become educated as we proceed and see the value proposition. It's $150 billion of market in the U.S. right now, a tiny fraction of what it can be. This can be a $1 trillion+ market. How are we going to meet the electricity needs for EV vehicles, for all of our reliability and grid stability, if we don't have large economical baseload electricity? And I agree with you. We're friends of the fossil industry. We're all of the above. We're an all of the above strategy. So we need everybody else. We need to support everybody meeting our nation's energy security needs.
Awesome. Well, Ed, thank you. And congratulations too. As someone who has applied to the U.S. Patent Office for patents, that is a difficult process. To hear about the fact that every count you put up, you got, that's huge. That's huge. Well, look, so as far as the way forward, again, we started off talking about our Secure the Grid Coalition. That's the platform by which we came to know about this issue. That's sort of the platform that we're going to be using to promote this policy initiative. If you're not a member of the Secure the Grid Coalition, and it's not like you have to have a formal membership, if you're just interested, we do the weekly calls at this time every Friday. A huge shout out to Doug Ellsworth, who does a weekly email roll up with all of the news and all of the updates as it pertains to securing our nation's electric grid. But in terms of that specific way forward for this topic, what we're going to have, you all that register for this webinar, of course, we have your email address. You will receive an email within the next couple of days that's going to give you the opportunity to actually advocate for this policy. There's something called Align Act. It's a platform where you can take an idea and share it with your elected officials. So just like Stephen said, governors, even the people in the federal government who we have to encourage to look to a private sector solution. What we will be doing is we're going to have a video recording of this webinar. We'll have a link to it so that somebody can watch it to get smart on the topic. And then we're going to have a series of really policy priorities that you will be able to share with your elected official. Just with a couple clicks of the mouse, you'll be able to send it to your state, elected officials and at the state legislature level, and your governor, to your U.S. representatives and senators, and to the proper people within the federal government that ought to be the recipients of this great policy idea. In terms of investment opportunities, again, our nonprofit is not funded by Curio or any company that can profit from this. But if you're interested in this as an investment opportunity, I certainly would be. And just reach out to us. We can put you in touch with Curio for that additional and separate conversation. So I just appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. We will respect everyone's time and close us out at the 1 hour mark. And stay tuned, because if we get a lot more questions about this, we're happy to do another webinar on the same topic and dig in even deeper. So again, thanks to everyone who could join, and just look out for an email from us, and check your junk box. It's a constant contact email, right? So it's not always going to end up at the top, but you will get that from us within the next couple of days, and it'll give you a chance to advocate for this really important idea of not wasting something that could power our country for the next couple of 100 years. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.